speakers. I am Dr. Robert Farley of the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce. And with me today is Josh Foust from the American Security Project, fellow at the American Security Project. Josh has written extensively on Afghanistan and Central Asia. And we are delighted to have him here for the first time on Foreign Entanglements. You've done blogging heads in the past, right?
I have, yeah, a couple times. Just not your show, I guess it's called.
Right. Well, I think so far everybody has been to our show the first time since we started this a few weeks ago. As always, I should remind everyone that there is a Facebook page. You can go ahead and like it if you so choose. We do the old thing where they used to have a bunch of links that were associated with the video blog. Now we put those on the Facebook page, and so probably we'll put some links of interest up after this particular video blog. So how are you today?
Oh, I'm good. Just trying to keep up with everything that's happening. It's been a busy couple of days, at least, in the Afghanistan universe. So, trying to keep my head above water, keeping track of everything.
Right. Well, how about you start out and tell us where we are right now? I mean, what do we know right now, and what does the situation look like right now in Afghanistan?
Yes.
Obviously, we're talking today in regards to the massacre that happened 2 days ago.
Right. So 2 days ago, this is at least the most recent story that I've read. A U.S. Army soldier supporting Special Operations Forces in Kandahar, Afghanistan, snuck off his base and went to a couple of houses nearby, lining people up and shooting them in the head. Last I checked, he had killed 16 people, 9 of them children. Several women are mixed in with that as well. And then he walked back to his base, and there's a little bit of a dispute over whether he turned himself in or whether the Afghan security forces turned him in. I don't know if we have a definitive take on that yet in terms of the details of how he got captured. But since then, there has been a somewhat expected outcry from Afghan officials who have been decrying the killings, calling it murder, demanding that it be brought to justice. There's a bit of a movement in Afghanistan to bring him to an Afghan court to face trial, because this is really the first time something of this magnitude has happened. There have been previous incidents where a similar number of civilians have been killed, but those have been in combat situations. This is the first time there's really been like a premeditated murder. So he's doing that. This morning, a delegation of senior officials that had visited one of the attack sites came under fire from insurgents who claimed to be seeking revenge for the killings. So it's turning into something of a tricky security situation, which again, a lot of people kind of expected to happen. But so far, people are still mostly just reeling from it because it was a pretty shocking act of violence, and we're all just trying to figure out how to react to it.
Right. I mean, it was pretty stunning to me when I heard about it. I think it's been pretty stunning to everyone who has had any experience. I mean, is there any? I know that some people initially were sort of wondering, how did he get off base without really anybody noticing, and how potentially did he get back onto base? But, I mean, I guess a staff sergeant would have the best if anybody could do it, a staff sergeant could do it, right? They could get in and off the base, and they would know where people... I mean, we have nothing in a sense of motivation at this point, we would presume some sort of frustration.
Go ahead.
The
latest that's come out on that, so he was a staff sergeant in the Army, and because this was a special operations base, normally you don't have kind of regular Army guys there. He was there to coordinate or run in some way the perimeter security for that base. So he understood how it worked. He was involved in some way in administering the perimeter security of that base. So it makes sense that he would know how to either go outside without arousing suspicions or to sneak past without people noticing him. I mean, he was an insider to that. In terms of motivations, there hasn't been any real motivations put out yet. We still don't know who this guy is. But from what the military's been saying about him, they've been trying to leave these hints that he had a traumatic brain injury, that he was dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, that he had been on a number of deployments to Iraq, and that could maybe explain why he snapped or just kind of lost it in this case. But nothing is set in stone, and part of that is because we don't really know who this guy is or what his real history is. We just kind of have generic statements out of the military, so it's hard to really dig into his psyche and what was driving this.
Right. I mean, none of those I think and I've seen the same stuff about the TBI. I hadn't heard about the PTSD, but it obviously makes sense. I mean, it seems to me that the Army people are sort of pushing this out, not quite in an exculpatory, but in sort of, well, this is an explanation, an excuse/explanation. But of course, that simply shifts responsibility from the individual to the Army, right? It's obviously if there was some sort of problem that was stemming from PTSD from extended tours, or some sort of problem that was stemming from a traumatic brain injury which had not been properly diagnosed, or there hadn't been proper expectation of what was going to be result from it. That's a real problem for the Army, right? I mean, it moves the onus of responsibility more to the Army. And so it's sort of interesting that we've seen that come out in the last couple of days. We've seen that sort of conversation about it.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about that, too, is if you do accept that explanation, that he had a TBI and was suffering from PTSD, I mean, that still doesn't really reflect well on the Army. It means they either are incapable of diagnosing these kinds of disorders, or if they do, then when they are diagnosed, the Army declines to act on them. I mean, it doesn't make them look good. I mean, from a political perspective, I'm almost more surprised they're not sticking with the he snapped and we have no idea why he snapped. I mean, there's a real danger, and usually the Army is more sensitive about this, of if this guy did have some kind of psychological issues, especially if he was dealing with PTSD, then this starts the danger of kind of reviving this soldier or veteran as ticking time bomb scenario that so many veterans' rights groups are rightfully fighting back against, because it's not the reality of veterans coming home from the war. They don't snap and go violent like that. But if the Army's attempt to cover its ass on this is that they're going to portray this guy as being a PTSD sufferer and being kind of like a typical Army combat vet, then, I mean, that's going to have some really unfortunate, especially social consequences for other veterans, which it just seems like it's in really poor taste from the Army right now.
Right. I suspect that part of the answer right now is that the Army was just as shocked as this by anyone else, right? Yeah. And they have not been able to either get onto one message or stay on one message with regards to exactly how to respond to what happened. I mean, especially this is concerning, given that, as you suggest, he had specific responsibility for managing the base, right? And so, he was obviously in a situation where he had the ability to go and do something unfortunate. So what are we looking at right now? I mean, you mentioned a little bit about insurgent attacks in the same area when they were investigating the crimes. I mean, what has been the reaction so far from sort of, I'll broadly line up three major groups, right? The Afghan government, the Taliban, and sort of more generally the Afghan population. I mean, what are we seeing right now in terms of public reaction in Afghanistan?
Yeah, so I think it might actually be best to go directly in the order of what you said. The Taliban's reaction has been about what you would expect from this. So they're outraged. They're claiming that this is just more evidence that America is in a war against Islam and a war against Afghanistan, not a war for Afghanistan. In a lot of ways, what this guy did was a huge propaganda victory for them, because it confirmed a lot of the worst things that they had said about Americans that, frankly, a lot of Afghans had ignored. It's just saying, look, this doesn't line up with my day-to-day experience of the American soldiers I have to work with, so therefore I reject your narrative. What this guy did was lend credence to those. From the Afghan government's perspective, there's been an incredible outpouring of anger about this. I think bloodthirsty is probably too denigrating, but they are eager to see this guy tried in Afghanistan by an Afghan, at least, panel of judges or something like that. There have been competing proposals put forward by different government figures. But there's definitely a demand for justice in this case. And the typical path that these take in U.S. courts is several years of haggling, especially with something of this magnitude. I mean, the death penalty is probably going to be on the table, which means years of appeals and years of retrials. And from Afghanistan's perspective, that's not good enough. So the government had already been... And
the policy there, with no real guarantee of an outcome, right? I mean, we sort of remember similar cases in Iraq, right, where, I mean, there just is no it's not like you can say there is an end to the rainbow. I mean, in the end, he might be acquitted for whatever reason, right? Especially if there were a TBI or there was some sort of PTSD situation.
Exactly, and I think we saw that with the Kill Team in 2010, that also went on this bizarre rampage, murdering Afghan civilians. None of them are getting the death penalty, even though they committed a fairly premeditated murder several times over, and then tried to cover it up and collected body part trophies. So, you're right, there is no guarantee here, but even if this, I was posing kind of a hypothetical that even if the military does try to press for the death penalty against this guy, with the length of time these courses take, it's just not good enough for what Afghan officials want for justice. And the reasoning behind this is because they've been complaining for years about how the U.S. doesn't pay sufficient attention to Afghan civilian casualties. And from a moral perspective, many of them don't even distinguish between accidental civilian casualties during combat and then what this guy did of walking up to people while they're sleeping and shooting them in the head. But that gets at, I think, the third group that you mentioned, which is the Afghan people themselves. There have been some small protests. There was one in Kandahar this morning. There was another one a little later in the day in Nangarhar. But we're not seeing the same huge outpouring of fury on the street that we did after, say, the Quran burnings last month. And I think part of that gets back to this lack of a moral distinction between accidental and deliberate civilian deaths, at least from Afghanistan's perspective. In a way, and it sounds kind of weird to say this, but in a way, they're almost used to the idea of Americans killing Afghan civilians. It still angers them, they're still shocked and disgusted by it, but they're not surprised because it doesn't seem like it's this wretched, out-of-character act that happened. In the way that the Quran burnings were. That's a sufficiently rare event that I don't think any of them really expected that to be coming. But from kind of a broad perspective, a lot of Afghans look at that and think, well, okay, so here's another American killing a bunch more Afghan civilians. Great. More evidence of what I already suspected. So I think that's why so far there hasn't been this huge, catastrophic public reaction. If the case gets handled in a way that people find really shocking or really disgusting, or if there's some other kind of incident in relatively short order, that could change. I don't think that's set in stone. But at least right now, apart from the government itself, there's been a surprisingly muted reaction to this.
Now, and we should say, that there is, essentially no chance that he'll be tried by Afghan justice, right? When he will. We know the path that this will go. He will go through the United States military justice system,
by which he could be tried in Afghanistan either.
Right.
So, we signed a SOFA with Afghanistan, a status of forces agreement in 2003, I think, that stipulates that all uniformed servicemen and contractors are considered administrative and technical staff of the embassy, or at least given the same kind of protection under the Geneva Accords. So I think unless you could make some sort of case that he's an exception to that, then he would have to be tried in an American justice system.
Right. So that's basically what we should expect to see.
Yeah.
Now, Adam Elkis, and I know you interact with him on Twitter occasionally, and I think it was Adam Elkis who wrote this morning that this is the end of the notion of the strategic corporal. And I know we hadn't really talked about going into coin theory, and we don't have to do it very much, but that this and the Quran, it's neither of which were planned, obviously, and neither of which could really be planned for in any sort of meaningful sense, but that would have sort of obvious political repercussions. Sort of more generally undercuts the whole notion that you can have a totality of effort, political and military, project for counterinsurgency, state building, whatever you want to call it. That just the way Adam phrased it seemed to make a lot of sense to me. And I know that I'm pretty sure you have pretty strong feelings about sort of the counterinsurgency turn anyway. But do you have any particular thoughts on that notion?
I agree with what Adam wrote about that. I would actually take it a few steps further and say that the strategic corporal concept was kind of inherently flawed from the beginning. I think that overestimated the effects of kind of minor cultural slights and underestimated the need for proper strategic and operational training and context for guys that you have at the sharp end of the spear, whatever the right phrase is. Obviously talking about counterinsurgency and kind of its intellectual issues is probably not for right now. But I think the point that he was getting at, in that a lot of the kind of theoretical happy talk that accompanied much of the planning for the Afghan war doesn't make sense. And this guy's rampage is one example of how that doesn't make sense, both from the perspective of how Afghanistan is reacting to it, and then also from the U.S.'s inability to cope with some kind of black swan event like this happening. But that it was already not working. And I made this case in a piece that I wrote for CNN last night, that the war had been going really badly for a while, and there had already been these social and political forces building up inside Afghanistan for a while. And this guy's rampage doesn't fundamentally alter those. So from the perspective of like the war's strategy, or from the direction that it was going, all this guy did was push it a little further down the slope. He didn't actually change its direction or alter it in some way. So looking at it in terms of counterinsurgency even, I don't think makes a whole lot of sense, because counterinsurgency itself was already failing in Afghanistan. And because of that, this guy isn't going to make it fail like extra. I mean, he's just going to continue that trend of having it fail.
Right. Although, and now I think we can do a sort of an interesting pivot to the American political scene and the impact on the American political scene. Because, I mean, this is the sort of event where, and I don't remember exactly who made the argument or who phrased it this way, but, even Rick Santorum cannot deny that this is an event unworthy of an apology, right? I cruised some right-wing blogs just for fun last night, and I mean the comment threads are almost completely devoid of the sort of argument that you saw 5 or 6 years ago in Iraq, right? That it's necessary to stay the course, it's necessary to continue the war, that it's in U.S. national security interest and so. But of course, it was never phrased precisely those ways in comment threads. But I mean, I won't say universal. Blog commenters are a special breed, but there seems to be. I mean, I don't know if you could say that this event catalyzed, but I mean, perhaps potentially you could say this event catalyzed a degree of opposition from the war, opposition to continuing the war from sectors that we hadn't previously seen opposition. And I think Newt Gingrich has sort of came out yesterday and argued that this should be the end, or this needs to be the end, or something along those lines. Even to the extent that we can't say, and we shouldn't say, that this transforms the narrative within Afghanistan, is this the sort of event that could catalyze greater opposition, or, and these aren't exactly the same thing, a reduction of support for continuing the war within the United States, even along the lines that Obama has proposed, which is a drawdown to 68,000 by September and then a further drawdown after that. Are the primary effects of this really going to be politically within the United States rather than within Afghanistan?
Yeah, and I think you're definitely right in terms of noticing this kind of groundswell of opposition from the GOP. That's actually been going on for about a year and a half, maybe a little longer at this point. I remember last year there was actually a GOP-led caucus in the House of people opposing the war. I mean, I don't think there's really an appetite for total withdrawal, but at least opposing the war in its current form on cost grounds, of saying, for what we're getting out of Afghanistan, it's not worth the cost. That got kind of crystallized and in a way probably delegitimized a little bit when Ron Paul picked it up and tried driving that home during the debates. But within the initial GOP debates, it wasn't terribly controversial for any of the candidates, really, to say things like, I don't think Afghanistan really deserves this much money and this much equipment and this much people and this much attention. So, we're definitely seeing that growing worse and worse as time goes on, but we're also seeing that growing on the left as well. And a lot of Democrats had lined up behind President Obama in 2008 and 2009 of saying, yes, Afghanistan is the good war, we have to go there, we have to do these things. And they're also, not switching sides, but they're also coming to the realization that the way the war has progressed in the last several years is actually bad, and that it's actually worse off than it was when Obama came into office. You can debate the reasons behind that. I don't think it's fair to lay all of that blame at his feet, but the fact is the current strategy hasn't achieved what its creators said it was going to. And I think people who look at that,
well, you can lay some of the blame at his feet, right? I mean, certainly, I mean, at least
he's the
in
commander in
terms of
chief, and I get that he's the decider, whatever the word is. But
right, and the narrative that came out when sort of the Afghan surge, the Afghan edition of the surge was decided on was, that perhaps he didn't like the options in front of him, and perhaps he had demanded other options. But in the end, he did go with the option that Crystal presented him. It's more complicated than that, obviously, because there's a lot of things going on in the Army hierarchy that make it more complicated, and the bureaucracy that make it more complicated. But certainly, he bears an element of responsibility.
Yeah, and I agree. I didn't want to downplay that too much.
Right.
I think on the right, it tends to get overly personified in President Obama, though.
Right.
And there's this reluctance to accept that foreign policy actually gets made in a system, and it's not solely the creation of the president.
Right.
Which is probably a different civil-military relations issue.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, you're definitely seeing this bipartisan movement within the American political scene that the war in Afghanistan is not serving American interests very well, and that for the benefits we get out of it, it's way too big and way too expensive. So I think especially once the election is done with, I'd be surprised actually if we didn't see a movement in some way to use legislation to force a downsizing of the war. I have no idea how big that's going to be. I don't know if it's even just going to be a symbolic issue that both parties decide to move past for expediency's sake, but I mean, you're definitely going to see some more legislation entered into the record that's going to be trying in some way to constrain the costs and extent of the war.
Right, and this will be very interesting. This will be very interesting, sort of as part of a whole set of constitutional issues about the relationship between the legislative and the executive branch in wartime. Right, and it could theoretically spar some very interesting fighting between the branches, and some very interesting fighting that might play out in the courts. And I'm not as much of an expert as I would like on those kinds of issues, and so. But we may see something like that. But I know that a lot of people have kind of wanted that to happen, right? A lot of people have wanted Congress to step forward. And some other people have argued that, no, Congress is sort of unfairly limiting the executive's power in wartime. So, I mean, I feel like right now I can sketch out how the Obama administration is going to play through this during the rest of the campaign. There's going to be an argument that whether true or not, there's going to be an argument that the United States surged into Afghanistan, that much good was done, but that by the time of the election there will be fewer American troops in Afghanistan than there were when Obama was president, that Obama is de-escalating the war, that there's an end in sight, and so forth and whatnot. And I don't think that this really changes the Obama narrative about the war, although it may change the emphasis, right? It may direct the emphasis more to saying, well, it's really over, and it's going to be over soon, and here are, not necessarily the troop withdrawal schedules, but here's what's going to happen, and people are going to be moving out. Now, what I am sort of what I find a little bit more complicated is how the Romney campaign is going to approach this. Because Romney, to the best of my recollection, was not one of the guys up there in the GOP debates who, as you suggested, it was not uncommon to see a lot of skepticism about the mission in Afghanistan. To my recollection, Romney was not the source of that kind of skepticism, but he held to, fairly consistently to the position that Obama was unfairly undersourcing the mission and so forth, but sort of a more traditional hawkish GOP position on the war. I think this makes that a much more complicated position for him to hold, if I'm characterizing him correctly.
I mean, maybe. I don't think Romney is really going to reverse his hawkishness on the war. I think you could look at his foreign policy team and see that, all of the people, I shouldn't say all because it's probably not all, but a huge number of the people advising him are basically imports from the Bush foreign policy team. And you're not going to get those kinds of people saying, no, we shouldn't be in Afghanistan anymore. You're going to get much more of a stay the course, finish the mission, we need victory type talk, which is normally what you get out of that crowd. I think you're right, though. Like, Romney hasn't really changed his tune the last, at least year back that I can think of. I don't see any reason to think that he's going to change his tune now. I mean, both sides, at least I would interpret both sides as not really considering what happened on Sunday to be a massive game-changing event. Newt Gingrich said the war wasn't doable before news had broken of this massacre taking place.
Right.
So, I mean, there was already this big movement on the right to start opposing the war. Despite everything else going on, Mitt Romney had still decided to not oppose the war. So I don't think we really should expect there to be much of a change. You know, there aren't really hints coming out of his campaign team that they are going to be evolving or modifying his views on this. So, I mean, that's probably going to be how it shapes up then in the election, is that Obama's withdrawal program or withdrawal policy is too rapid. It leaves Afghanistan too much at the mercy of terrorists. It's going to all collapse like a house of cards when it's over with. I mean, we'll probably see that sort of talk out of him. And from the Obama's perspective, they're probably going to come right back and say, look, we accomplished our mission. We killed Osama bin Laden. The Democrats and Barack Obama killed Osama bin Laden, and you don't have any grounds to stand on because you didn't, and it's just going to be the same old talking points that each one throws at each other.
Right. No, I'm not. I definitely see that in the future, but I do think because the right is in some sense more divided than left. I mean, Obama can put forward a narrative that at least has the prospect of bringing the left together. Right. At least we're leaving. Right. Maybe we'll disagree about what happened in the last 4 years, but we're leaving, so that's okay. Whereas on the right, because of Romney's decision to maintain an old school hawkish, and I completely agree that this was sort of impossible to envision any other outcome with the set of advisors he has, that the narrative becomes a little bit more complicated than that. And I guess we probably won't see any commercials out there saying we're leaving Afghanistan too soon. It's unlikely that we'll see any TV commercials on that particular issue, but maybe we wouldn't have anyway. So to move to actually consequential issues, because it's always sort of absurd to talk about the American election in the context of these 16 women and children who were massacred by an American soldier. I mean, and we don't have to talk about it particularly in the case of this incident, but what does the future of state building in Afghanistan look like? I mean, assuming that either Obama continues with the plan that seems to be the plan, or Romney adopts something after becoming president, adopts something that's broadly similar. I mean, what are we looking at in terms of an Afghan state that's trying to build state capacity, that's trying to fight insurgents? I mean, what do the next 3 or 4 years look like, given the realities of American politics, in your view?
Yeah, so if Obama goes through with his withdrawal plan, we're not really going to see any kind of state building or capacity building happening inside Kabul. Those efforts have been kind of stillborn or stuck in place for a while. I mean, I'd draw it back actually to before Obama was in office, but definitely during the latest counterinsurgency phase that Afghanistan has gone through, those really haven't advanced very much. So, looking at U.S. plans for the country, there aren't political plans in place. There are military plans in place, but they haven't put in place a political strategy or political framework to actually bring the conflict to some sort of reasonable close. Near as I can tell, and I mean, I hope I'm not just really badly missing something, but the strategy that President Obama laid out and then the implementation that the military has come up with to achieve that strategy basically boils down to training as many Afghan soldiers and policemen as they possibly can, and then leaving and reducing American commitment to only training those soldiers, and then calling that withdrawal. From most of the
is there a counter-terror special forces aspect to that as well?
Yeah, there is. And people don't like counting special forces when they talk about boots on the ground. I mean, we had a couple of hundred special forces and special operations forces in Libya, and people said, no, that's not boots on the ground. They're doing special operations things. So, I mean, there will still be that CT presence there, and you'll probably still have, like, intelligence assets running drones over Pakistan, a huge collection effort. I mean, there was that story in the AP a couple of weeks ago about how the CIA was going to take over from JSOC or something. So there's definitely still going to be some kind of kinetic activity happening there, but the mainstream army, the people that we actually consider relevant when we talk about whether or not there are troops in the country, they're going to be reduced significantly down to a training role. But there's no end state after that, and that's really the problem that I have with that strategy. It's not, we'll train for 5 years and then reevaluate, and if things are at this stage, then we're going to withdraw. It's just, well, no, we're going to reduce to a training mission, and then that's sustainable. That's winning. We can hang on to that for a while.
Right.
And I think that's not only wildly unrealistic in the sense of, if you can't train a decent-sized army with 100,000 troops there to give them breathing room to get their heads around things, you're probably not going to do that when they have to be actively fighting a high-paced battle against the Taliban. But also, I mean, that's basically a forever plan. It's something that can exist in perpetuity, but doesn't actually have an end state. And it's being defined in terms of things that don't happen. So as long as al-Qaeda doesn't come back to Afghanistan, and as long as the Taliban doesn't overthrow the government, then you're in a victory state. But that's a victory state that can be reversed at any moment in time, and any deviation from it indicates mission failure. So I don't think there was a lot of thought going into what the long-term strategy for the country is going to be. And in the course of designing all of these, what they're still missing are the very real political conflicts that are driving the war right now. And without addressing those political conflicts, I don't think we have any grounds on which to be optimistic about the war ever ending.
So all this discussion of unity of effort and sort of totality of government, and interagency cooperation and so forth, has basically reduced to a military strategy for handing over most of major operations to what we hope will be a mildly competent Afghan army. Right. I'm not thinking too much then about all of the other elements that go into the construction of a modern nation state.
Right. I mean, the version of, I guess, a modern nation state that people are talking about is some kind of reconciliation with the Taliban, which basically demands that they give up all of their goals, give up everything that they wanted to accomplish in fighting the government, and then join the government. I mean, that's right now the negotiations plan, is figuring out how to get the Taliban to surrender, essentially. That has nothing to do with building a nation state. It has nothing to do with building an effective government.
And in fact, even the most likely outcomes that you could envision from such negotiations, I mean, the most likely outcomes that seem to me are things that would directly undercut what we sort of more broadly consider as state-building activities, right?
Exactly.
Activities where there's a central state that can exert, not complete monopoly of force, but something, it can at least exert some force over much of the country, can collect revenue. Right, exactly. But sort of where the political direction is going right now, there seems to be absolutely nothing that seems geared to produce that outcome. Well, and I mean, is that an impossible outcome to produce anyway in Afghanistan?
I mean, okay, so in the like normal, almost European conception of what we would consider to be a successful functioning state, I think that's a totally unrealistic goal to have. But Afghanistan has had effective governments. They don't function with the same level of kind of centralized control that we're used to. They definitely don't function with the extreme amount of centrality that we've built into the current government, but they do exist. They normally function by having a strong ruler figure of some sort in Kabul who then uses his advisors underneath him to negotiate the way that Kabul will be interacting with the periphery inside Afghanistan. And then whenever one side or the other violates that periphery, the other one reacts violently, there's a period of nasty fighting, and then everything returns back to the norm, to kind of this uneasy equilibrium. Afghanistan existed.
Right. That's almost more of a classic imperial model, right? That sort of a nation-state model. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, or we could just look at it as individual regions within Afghanistan traditionally have had an unusually high amount of autonomy. And that what we're asking them to do with the current government is to give up this autonomy they've historically enjoyed, and we're not giving them a choice. We're not allowing them to say, no, we don't want to give up our autonomy. And that causes a lot of problems. It creates this fundamental tension that the U.S., as foreigners with a different religion and very little understanding of the history involved, don't have the means to navigate effectively. But we've decided that it is our responsibility to navigate that effectively and to put in place a responsive local government that has ties going all the way back up to the center, ultimately to Hamid Karzai, because of the way we designed their constitution. I think the result of that has been this kind of hollow state that people talk about in Afghanistan. I mean, it's in a lot of ways a Praetorian state. We've created this military, but we haven't created a government for that military to serve. And then we've decided that creating that military is the only thing we want to accomplish there.
Right. All right, so if we could briefly sort of move beyond the borders of Afghanistan and think about, sort of again going back to this, next 4 or 5 years, it's a short term, but maybe even to the medium term. How does what's going to play out in Afghanistan and what the U.S. has envisioned for Afghanistan, which is sort of a perpetual continuation of some sort of conflict there? I mean, it seems sort of hard to envision peace coming to Afghanistan. How does that play out in the context of regional politics in Central Asia, sort of from the sweep from Pakistan up into the former Soviet republics? I mean, are there extra-national, or to what extent are there extra-national effects of what's currently going on and what will be a withdrawal? And the reason I ask you this is because you write about this stuff. You're the go-to guy, at least on Twitter, for this kind of stuff.
So, okay.
Let me phrase that differently. Yeah, you can put these kinds of thoughts into 140 characters better than anybody I know. So.
Okay, thanks. So from Pakistan's perspective, our relationship with Islamabad is probably, the lowest it's able to go without us actively being at war with each other. And that might be a bit of an exaggeration, but not that much of an exaggeration. There is a lot of uncertainty about how that is going to evolve. I think especially after the war in Afghanistan winds down a little bit. One of the main reasons why war supporters, and I've used this argument before too, because I don't think it's not an illegitimate point to make. It's unrealistic the way it's currently being expressed, but a lot of people who support the war want the war to continue because of their concern about what's happening inside Pakistan, both with that country's struggle with Islamic militants, its rolling dispute with India, its rolling dispute, frankly, with Afghanistan. They still have an unsettled border. And then also its 100 or so nuclear weapons that everyone is terrified about falling into the wrong hands. I think there's a lot to say about whether or not an unstable Afghanistan puts any of that at risk, but that's definitely a concern.
Well, there's even sort of the counter-argument, right, that the stability of Pakistan depends on an unstable Afghanistan. Exactly. At least I've seen that argument before.
Exactly. And I think the real question here is whether the United States continues to execute its drone campaign in northwest Pakistan. From everything that we've been able to put together, we being like generic the United States scholars in America, the people in the FATA, so the people in the most affected regions of northwest Pakistan where these drone strikes happen, do actually like those drone strikes. They think they get rid of militants, they support them, they understand that relatively few civilians get killed in the process, and they think it's okay. The problem is in the rest of Pakistan, those drone strikes are deeply controversial, to the point of almost triggering irrational behavior on the part of Pakistanis because they get so angry about this drone war happening. And just today, I think Sherry Raymond, the new Pakistani ambassador to the U.S., gave the latest request of Pakistan that the U.S. officially end the drone war in northwest Pakistan. That's something that's going to continue to define relationships between the three countries, between the U.S. and Pakistan and between Afghanistan and Pakistan. There is still the supply corridor going through Pakistan that is closed off since the November 24th strike that killed 24 frontier corps. So killed, Pakistani citizens, Pakistani soldiers. They weren't militants.
Right.
So that's
that was a helicopter strike, wasn't it?
That was a helicopter strike. But that's still, I think, related to this idea that the U.S. asserts the right to project kinetic force over the border. It's all part of an ecosystem. Drones are the easiest way of doing it, but they're not the only way of doing it. We had a team of Navy SEALs fly over the border to get Osama bin Laden. We do this in other circumstances. What that's done is forced U.S. attention northward, primarily into places like Uzbekistan. And that's carried with it its own costs. It's received a tremendous amount of pushback from the human rights community because they think that the regime of Islam Karimov, the guy who runs Uzbekistan, is so abusive and so toxic that the U.S. just risks too much from a moral perspective engaging with them. I don't personally agree with that perspective. I think it's kind of short-sighted and loses the regional context that drives the decision in the first place. But I mean, that's definitely there, and they're not shy about making themselves very heard when officials try to talk about this. There's also a bigger issue about what's going to happen with the Manas Transit Center in Kyrgyzstan. That's where I think all soldiers now fly through there on their way in and out of Afghanistan. The lease on that is slated to end in June of 2014, and the new president, Atambayev, he has said that the lease is not going to be renewed after June, that he doesn't want the base there anymore. He doesn't want a permanent U.S. military presence in the region. He's worried about it being the target of reprisal attacks if the U.S. decides to go to war somewhere else, blah, blah, blah. There are a lot of other reasons for that.
Right. I mean, and leaders of that country have been able to be bought off before for a variety of different incentives.
And actually, Secretary Panetta is in Bishkek right now talking with the Kyrgyz government, trying to convince them to extend the lease, or at least be open to the idea of extending the lease. So, I mean, that story definitely isn't told. But what it means is that there's definitely an awareness on the part of U.S. policymakers that shifting things north, away from Pakistan, because Pakistan has turned out to be such a messy problem that they don't know how to work with. So they're trying to shift their regional focus north into the post-Soviet states in Central Asia. And they're running up against all kinds of barriers, both as a result of geography, because these countries are landlocked and they're really hard to get to, but then also because the politics of these countries are really complex, and in a lot of cases they're really static. And the U.S. has never been very good at navigating those politics. They've been good at high-level relationships with the dictators who run them, but they haven't been good at engaging either with their governments or with their societies in a systemic way to really make a solid bid for influence there. So I think that's kind of how things are going to be changing in the future. I know both Uzbekistan and Tajikistan have officially, like in official circles, expressed concern about militancy moving northward from Afghanistan into Central Asia once the U.S. leaves. This is kind of a repeat of the 90s when the IMU was using northern Afghanistan as a base and using that to launch attacks into Central Asia. I think they're worried about that happening again, especially because the IMU has been resurging in the north as well. But in terms of how all that's going to play out, I mean, it's way too early in the game to really tell. What the current U.S. plan to do is to pivot these security and transit relationships that the U.S. government has with each one of these regimes and turn them into trading and financial relationships. And that's where you get people like Secretary Clinton, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, talking about things like the New Silk Road, which is supposed to take all of the supply lines that go through Central Asia and turn them into trade routes, either over railways or highways or whatever they're able to build at any given time. But there's a lot of resistance to that. The governments all say that they like these things and they want to work with the U.S. and everything is wonderful. But when you actually get down to having them make decisions, kind of get over themselves in a lot of cases because there are tremendous egos involved with the men who run these countries, there's very little rubber actually meeting the road. So, however the diplomacy turns out, I think is really going to determine what the U.S. feels it's able to do, especially in the 2015 and onward time frame.
Right. I mean, this is sort of, I mean, it's all, not being a regional expert, it's all very interesting. Did you ever watch, and this is going to seem like an extremely odd question, did you ever watch Deadwood, the HBO show?
No.
Oh, okay. There's a great scene where one of the characters says to another character, nobody gets out alive. And what he's meaning there is life, right? That in the end everybody dies, which, is to say in some sense that everything is dynamic, right? That there's no particular end state. Sometimes it seems to me that U.S. policy, not just in this region but in other regions, is geared towards creating an end state, right? Creating a state in which we no longer have to think so much about this issue, right? We no longer have to think of the dynamism and the complexity of political interactions both within states and across states, and that this vision of how we can manage relations in a particular region to create a viable end state is inherently destined for failure, right? That there will always be a degree of dynamism, that there was always going to be change. And the best we can ever hope to do is to not exactly go with, but to manage flows back and forth. And I don't think that's unique to this region, but perhaps because there seemed, from a United States perspective, to be this long static period in the politics of Central Asia, obviously when the Soviet Union existed, and now it's a region where we do have to worry about dynamism. There seems to be, just a set of contradictions in how the United States is thinking about gearing politics in Central Asia and gearing its own policies in Central Asia, especially in terms of relations with Afghanistan. I don't know. I just sort of...
Yeah. I mean, I think that's mostly right, actually. I'd take it a step further even and say that the end states the United States says it wants to work towards, so the goal that they're working towards, in a lot of cases is built much more on wishful thinking and kind of this hard-nosed, pragmatic look at what's realistically achievable.
Right.
I mean, like the New Silk Road concept, which a lot of people are pushing around, I think is a great example of this. It's something that sounds really awesome. I mean, everyone would want there to be this regional trade network through the heart of Asia. The problem is that from a practical perspective, it faces a lot of barriers, starting with politics, going through to economics, and then ending with just sheer geography and logistics, none of which really argue in favor of there being these land-based trade routes going through Central Asia in the 21st century. So, there are a number, and I'd have to think to pull more up, but there are a number of things like that sound really great in theory. But then when you actually go back and look at what it would take to put these into place, you become a lot less optimistic about their ability to actually come through. And I think your point about management is right on. That's actually something I would say should apply to Afghanistan as well, is that instead of trying to think about it in terms of victory or defeat, we should be looking at it in terms of management. So there is a threat from Central Asian militancy based in Afghanistan. What's the best way of managing that and then minimizing it? Because I think from a realistic perspective, we're not going to be able to destroy it entirely or eliminate it or neutralize it entirely. So we need to take a different perspective and look at it from a risk perspective instead of from a threat perspective. And I think doing that will open up a lot more options for policymakers if they can actually get to that point.
Right. Although that is a message, I think, that you would find a lot of appeal in elite circles, and there would be a lot more trouble explaining it at a more popular level, right? Explaining the management versus threat concept at a more popular level. Especially when it becomes important, when it becomes relevant, right? I mean, a lot of the time people are going to say, oh, well, we sort of managed the situation in that area, until some sort of acute situation happens and public attention is derived to it and they want sort of a resolution to the threat. But at least elites should be thinking in that direction.
Example of this. In the 2004 campaign, he tried saying that terrorism was not this existential threat to the United States. It's a problem that we need to learn how to manage through law enforcement, through intelligence. And he was right. And he got creamed for it. The public wasn't having any of it. So, I mean, I agree with you. This is one of those things that actually is a good idea and makes sense from a rational perspective, but politically there's so little space for anyone in an elected position to maneuver on it that, I mean, I'm sure you share this, but I'm not optimistic that we're going to see that kind of a change in rhetoric.
No, I don't think so. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. I think all Foreign Entanglements conversations are great, but this has been a fantastic conveation. I mean, do you have anything to add before we roll?
Not really. I think I emptied my brain the last 45 minutes.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and we hope to have you in sometime soon.
Absolutely. I enjoyed it a lot. Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
All right.